Yes, it is. I'm going to through one more time if you want. Good morning, everybody. We've been talking a lot about flourishing, to flourish. I don't know about you. Don't know about your life. I don't know if you would evaluate your life and say, I am flourishing. You see these beautiful pictures up there of people hugging in a park and eating in a beautiful park and hugging each other. And when we do this series, we take it very seriously that God wants us to flourish. And we've talked about different areas of life where we can flourish in our own lives. But then I look at those pictures and I look at my own life and I ask myself, am I flourishing? I ask you, are you flourishing? What does that mean exactly? I remember as a child, I think back to things I wanted to be. I always wanted to be a policeman. I told my kids that when they were like 18, 15, and they all burst out laughing. They thought that was the most ridiculous thing ever. I was kind of offended, like, I could be a policeman. And they're like, no, you couldn't. What did you want to be when you grew up? I remember one of my kids said a lion, and I thought, oh, your life is going to be filled with heartache, a lion. As kids, we ask ourselves what we want to be, and we don't often think about what we want to be like when we're older. We think about what we would want to do, but not what we would want to become. And as I've gotten older, and I look back at the things I wanted to do, man, you realize that is a kid question. That's not the big question, though. That's not the adult question. Like, who am I? Who do I want to be? Who am I becoming? When we talk about flourishing, when this theme came up, I told Phil, I'll do flourishing in purpose. But I started with that word flourishing, and I looked it up in the dictionary, and it says, it's stated of a person, animal, or another living organism that grows or develops in a healthy or vigorous way as the result of a particularly favorable environment. Well, what if your environment was not favorable? What if your environment was less than favorable? Can you still flourish? And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what it means to flourish when it comes to your purpose. Now, many of you know I lead a gap year program for young adults, ages 17 up to around 30-ish, right? And one of the things that my wife does with them, she does this activity called life mapping. And life mapping, it's like $40, $50 to get the packet, but they're different maps. And each week, one of our young people would work on a map. The first one is just an overview of their life. They fill out this map, and it's an overarching, view of their life. And then they get in front of the group, and we've all promised for ourselves the secrecy, that we won't share outside the group. But then each one is given 10 to 15 minutes to basically say, this has been my life. And they can pick certain highlights. But then the next week, it goes much, much deeper. Because then they have to identify the valleys in their lives. They're to spend time in prayer and to doing the work that's involved as they go through this packet of their deepest, darkest, most painful moments. And it's young people, so you're like, how painful can it be? They haven't even lived yet. It's incredibly painful. And each time as they share, they're sharing their brokenness and their pain. As one person said, the voice inside me has told me, run, run, run all week. Like, leave this program, run. But this person didn't. They faced it. And then when they shared, they get up and they choose one of those valleys. And we say, you don't have to share something that's too personal. Meet with us individually later with your mentor, and we'd encourage you to do that. But lean into this. Trust us with your story. And as these tragic, horrible stories are told, it's like a holy moment. It's like as I sit there listening and I'm taking notes of any impressions I have, I'm just always amazed as these kids have deep stories and they're worth being told. There's deep pain, there's deep hurt, they're worth being told, And it becomes a holy moment as they trust that. I think it's such a valuable thing. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over is they're all in the end saying, we believe in God. We want to find what our purpose is. We want to know that path. You know, I'm hoping over the next year that God will show me the path. And as each one shared that, I just had this mental picture of a person standing not before the path, but thousands of paths. And God is God of all of them. And God is just sitting back saying, cut yourself some slack. There are thousands of paths. There's not the path. You know, I am the way, Jesus said. That's a path that transcends all other paths. But what if our life isn't just what is the path that God has for us? What if God is putting before you hundreds of paths and saying, I am the God of all the paths? Pick. Choose. Some paths are hard. Some paths are easier. Some paths are going to require a lot of work, but I'm the God of all the paths. Like, I can help you flourish in whatever path you choose. It's an interesting thing to think about. But I want to share with you a person. When I left right out of college with my wife, we moved to South America. We were there for 18 years. We lived in a lower middle class area, so we didn't live where most of the Americans would live and the wealthy. We didn't live in the slums either. We lived middle class, lower middle class, and there was a lady, Maria, right there, Maria Barona. Maria lived just a few doors down from us in this middle class area, and we came to know her. Or I don't remember who of us studied the Bible. Nisha studied the Bible with her. I think actually baptized her. But she did most of the work, but we formed a relationship with Maria, and Maria joined a church we started, and she was the rock star of this church. She was the rock star of this church in that she was always there. Anything that their church had going on, Maria was there. She was in the front row. She radiated joy. She radiated encouragement. She was the most influential person in that church. What people didn't know about Maria is the reality of her life. You know, as we looked at all the pictures, the beautiful pictures in the trailer coming up on Flourishing, I asked that question, is your life flourishing? You know, would your life be reflected in there? What about those who aren't flourishing? What if they're not in an environment? Most of us probably here today, if we look at where we are now, we may not have the job that we dreamed of. We may not have the spouse that we thought we would have. We may not have a relationship with our children that we desire. We all live in a broken world, and I'm not talking about religious persecution. No, just the Bible says that the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, right? So many times as Christians, we put this beautiful picture of once Jesus came into my life, everything was changed and everything's wonderful. Everything does change, but not necessarily your environment. You're still stuck with you, with where you live, the people you live with and do life with. Life can be challenging. And what was challenging about Maria's life, even though she was the most influential woman in our church, is when you walked into her house, she had virtually nothing there but a fridge, a chair, a stove, and a bed. And she wouldn't live in that middle class section. Soon she would be downgraded and live in a poor area of town, where literally she had nothing because, see, Maria had children that had kind of broken off relationships with her. She had an older daughter who loved her, but married somebody who wanted her to have nothing to do with her. And then her other son got involved in drugs and a criminal lifestyle, and because of that, he had sold most of the possessions in her house. He had stolen from her repeatedly. And here is this woman all alone in life. And Jesus came in and she became this powerful force. But if you entered that house and you saw the conditions of her environment, you would have to ask yourself the question, what does flourishing mean for Maria? Like, there is a reason that the United States is still, there's other countries out there that are equal, but the United States is still a place where somebody can come from an impoverished country and establish a life and do better here. It is a remarkable country to be able to do that. It's an amazing thing. You can flourish if you work hard. But some of us don't have, in where we are in our circumstances of life, that is more challenging. So today I want to just share, what does it mean to flourish on purpose? Because in the end, it's really not even about what you have. It's what you're here for. We all long for that, right? We all want to know, not only does God love me, but I have purpose. Like there's a reason I am here. And so one of the lessons that we want to learn is this. If we're going to understand flourishing in our purpose, we have to adopt God's perspective. God's perspective. There's a verse that says, His ways are not our ways, His thoughts are not our thoughts, right? Like God has this macro view of everything. He sees all the paths. He knows exactly what's going on. And He can redeem our valleys. As our kids share their valleys, one of the things we tell them is it takes courage to acknowledge your valleys. Sometimes it takes professional help to relive and look into those valleys. Those valleys, many times, were valleys not even caused by you. They were things that were done to you or experiences that you were powerless to change. And being a Christian does not mean denying those valleys, does not mean assuming blame for all those valleys. It does not mean denying the pain and the hurt that was there. And being a Christian does not mean we suddenly transform these valleys into these mythical, supernatural, God-ordained things. I had a ministry partner once whose marriage broke up because of infidelity, and this person later said, well, I guess God and His plans knew this, that. And I'm like, no. Don't attribute what your spouse did to anything God did. That was your spouse. That was unholy. That was wrong. And God had no part of that. But He can still redeem that valley. I'll tell you a story about this. Many of you know that I grew up a single mom. My dad left when I was 6. I've told this before, several stories today I've told before. My mom got remarried when I was 12 to a man who had lots of issues. He was a drinker. He was abusive. In between the ages of 6 and 12, I have virtually no memories. Well, I have a few. Like I could point maybe 4 to 6. Some of them not particularly good at all. Some pretty horrible. Right? But most of those memories are gone, and I didn't even know it until I was a senior in high school, and we had to do a timeline of our lives. And for every year, we were to write something down, and I got to year 6, the divorce, and I got to year 12, and I had nothing. I remember just crying. I was a senior in high school because I was just shocked. Like, you don't know what you don't know. And I wondered those 6 missing years, and, my dad left and didn't have a great stepfather, and I was like, who cares? Like, I'm fine. I was in the jungles of Central America as an 18 or 19-year-old when it finally hit me, like the lack of a father definitely affects how I view God. It made me question, like, well, what about my life? And I recognized that was a huge thing for me, Then I had kids, and I remember telling Nisha, like, no boys. I want no boys. Of course, we had 3 immediately. Right? I do not want that. I didn't have a father. I don't think I could be a good father to a boy. Give me girls. And then I had one girl, and I love her to death. Daddy-daughter relationship, very complicated. Not the daddy-daughter, just in general the girl. So now I praise God for 3 boys, right? But at the time, and our 2 oldest boys, they were still young, and we'd gone back to the States, and we had this nighttime ritual. We'd do the Barney Song of Love or whatever, the Barney song, and they'd put their jumpers on. And then I would put Joshua to bed, and I'd pray with him. And then I'd go to Andrew, and I would pray with him. We'd talk about his day. And usually his head would be rested here in my arm, and I would stroke his head and his face, tell him I loved him. And then he would fall asleep, and sometimes I would fall asleep. Like that was the nightly routine. I didn't get that as a kid, but I made sure my kids were going to get that, right? That's something I could do. And then one night, something very interesting happened. As I'm drifting off to sleep, like I'm almost asleep, I felt him like shift around, and he lifted my arm up. And then he lifted my head up, and he put his arm under my head. He began to caress my face and tell me he loved me. And it was this remarkable thing because it was almost like reverse. He was suddenly a father, and I was the child. It was like, I remember just starting to cry. It was like instead of wondering what happened in those 6 missing years, instead of realizing I never, my father wasn't there, it was almost like I was a child again and he was my father. It was this beautiful, precious moment. Now, when I look back, it's like God redeemed. It was like a special gift. My oldest son wasn't even aware of what was happening. But God redeemed that. It doesn't mean I can't look back at my life and recount, even with some pain. It's not a denial. Our valleys, we do not deny. We don't try to spiritualize and make it seem good. We call things as they are. But when God enters our lives and we trust Him with even our most painful things, He is willing to work through those to redeem them. We hear that for Christians, it says, death, where is your sting? Like for Christians, even the death is not the end. It still has a sting. But we don't grieve as the world grieves. In the same way, if we want to live a life on purpose, you have to acknowledge that God is not just a God of the mountains, like we looked at a few weeks ago. He's the God of your valleys. He can redeem those valleys. In God's economy, this is what God says: blessed are the poor. The meek will inherit the earth. A writer says, I must decrease, He must increase. It speaks to the least of these. It says, become like little children. And in God's world, it is not your mountaintops that only declare His majesty and His greatness. He will use anything that you give Him and place into His hand. And when you place your most difficult experiences into His hands and let Him work, He can redeem those experiences. So we don't cover them up and we don't pretend they're anything other than what they were, but we do release them into God's hands. If we want to flourish in purpose, you just have to understand that. Like, God, my plans were not yours. What I thought I wanted, what I thought I needed, I had no clue. You know. And so I'm just going to trust you. If you really want to flourish in your purpose, you have to say right now where you are, regardless of what your job looks like, what your relationship with your spouse or children, wherever you are in life, as contented or discontented as you may be, part of flourishing is recognizing God's plans aren't mine, and He'll redeem all the negatives. He will, if I allow Him. So there's some verses I'll just read through. Isaiah 43, 1 and 2. But now thus says the Lord who created you, O Jacob, and He who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overflow you. When you walk through fire, the fire you shall not be burned. No flame shall scorch you. Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, even those who are called according to His purpose. It says there in the Isaiah one, I just noticed, I have called you by your name. This is a personal God who's stepping into your story. I was thinking just this year, our students shared, and it kept coming up, all the names she was called as a child. I had a list I wrote down of all the names I was called. What is that about a name calling? When God says He has called you by your name, He is acknowledging you and that you are His. So it's a very important thing. Where are you right now? Where are you right now? Like if you're looking at your life and you're saying, am I flourishing? You may think, obviously I'm not flourishing. I've got issues. Here are my issues. Here are the things that I want to see change. Here's this and that. All that's great. I hope you will hold to those lightly. And you'll say, God, here they are. It's my offering to you. I understand if I'm going to flourish, I have to relinquish something of the control of what I can and cannot control. And the hardest thing, and this is for Americans specifically, because we're so independent and we can believe we can do all things, we can get at it. Why do we need God if we can just work hard enough, right? That releasing of control is really hard. People who've lived in oppressive countries, they have no control anyway, so it's easier for them to trust in certain ways, I think. So that's the first thing. If there's a lesson here we're going to take is, man, if you want to learn what it means to flourish in purpose, you have to recognize God's sovereignty and his perspective. I'm going to start before we share the second lesson with another story. You know, I went right out of college with my wife to South America, went to a large city in Ecuador, Guayaquil, with like 4 million people, big city, like no greenery around, no trees, no grass. It was a very different life. It was a very violent city. And we started churches. I had no idea what I was doing. We didn't know what we were doing. We'd never started churches. And at one point, and again, I've shared this story before. At one point, you know, we go there for 3 years, come back for a few months, and then that would be what we would do. And we had this church of around 32 people that met, and we come into their lives, and their lives had changed through the grace of God and through the ministry. And before we were leaving to return to the States for 6 to 8 months, something like that, and they called a special meeting, a goodbye ceremony, you know. And this was going to be a great meeting. Now, we're stressed because we have kids and we have to pack up everything. We won't sleep all night because we'll have to pack everything away for 6 to 8 months. And so we go to this meeting, and every person that was part of that group of 32 stood up and began to share. And it was a beautiful night. They began to share, you know, this was my life, and then you guys came in, and God came in, and this is we love you, and there were tears. And we just watched a video of this last year. We have it on video, to my shame, because that night that was so special, in my eyes, was not special at all. If you watch the video, you see me seated, not looking at anybody, staring straight at the ground. And as each person shared, I felt worse and worse. Because one person began to share, and this person was already a little tipsy, had a little drinking problem, and they knew it was an emotional night, and we were that person's life, you know, and we were leaving, and so they started to share, and then another person started to share who had an equally dramatic, crazy story, and then another. All of these people were severely messed up. They were all messed up people. And as each one shared, I was just saying, oh God, like this person and this person and this person. And I remember saying, it got so bad at one point, I'm staring straight down, and I said, oh God, how do you expect me to start a church with this? That's what I said. How do you expect me to start a church with this? Like, give me just like 2 normal people with normal problems. That's all I want. Normal people with normal problems. And I remember just leaving that house so discouraged that night. Didn't hear hardly anything they said. We don't sleep all night. We get on the plane with all our kids, all our luggage. At some point, we're coming toward Florida. At some point, I'm in and out of sleep. I don't know if I was sleeping a dream or whatever, but I was reliving that night. And I was staring at the floor, and this person speaking, and this person, and I'm feeling worse and worse. And I get to the point in that memory where I say, oh God, how do you expect me to start a church with this? Give me like just 2 normal people with normal problems. And it was as clear as day. Like it wasn't an audible voice, but a voice very clearly said, I have placed 32 people in your hands, and all you've done is complain. And I shot up, like just upright, immediately awake, and immediately ashamed. I have placed 32 people in your hands, and all you've done is complain. And I asked forgiveness for it, and I shared it with my wife. Still don't know if it was the right move. But 8-10 months later, we were back in Ecuador. I called those people back for a meeting. And I ruined that night for them. Because for them, it was a beautiful night. And I told them, this is exactly what happened. And this is what I was feeling. And I want to ask your forgiveness. And I want you to know, I'm not going to look for anybody else. Like, we're it. We're it. And God did something in their lives. And he did something in my life. Who did I think I was? Thinking like I had my life together, right? He did something different. And so this is the second lesson. I would start out asking, who are the people God has placed in your hands right now? Like whether your life is like you want it to be, irregardless of your job, irregardless of who you're married to, who your spouse is, the relationship you have, irregardless of any of your circumstances, who are the people God has placed in your hands? How you answer that determines everything when it comes to your purpose. Because God's going to come down, and in the end of your life, he's not going to ask how much money you had, how much debt you had, how this. He's going to ask, how did you serve the people he's placed in your hands? So our second leadership lesson is God's plan is you. Like God has a plan to reach the world. He has a plan to help the entire world flourish for those who have ears to hear, for those who are willing. Most aren't. And his plan involves you. You. There's the younger generation of YouTube and social media. There's this phenomena that I personally love now. I spend way too much time between YouTube and TikTok and other stuff watching social media influencers, right? Influencers. That's a huge thing. Anybody under 20, 20 to 30, you get that. Like that is the world. These young people are doing things all over with product placement. They're getting paid. They're out there. And do you know why I appreciate that? That is the definition of leadership. Leadership is influence. It doesn't depend on how much of a leader you look like. It doesn't depend on how much you know. It doesn't depend on your authority, whether you're this or you're that. Those things can help or hinder. But in the Christian world, leadership is influence. I've asked this before from here. If you believed that everybody who you interact with, the people who God has placed in your hand, if you really believed that you had the power to influence each one of those people in your interactions, what would you do differently? If you really believed, and that's the response I would get when I've asked this question. You mean if I really believe that? Because we don't. See, our problem isn't that we don't have the skills. Our problem is we just don't believe we have the influence. Tell that to Maria, the woman in that church, the woman who had nothing. And yet she was the most influential person. She was that church's hero. Here's some verses. 1 Peter, this is what God says about you. This is what he says about me. See, our problem isn't that they haven't been said or we haven't read them. We just don't believe them, right? You yourselves are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. That's you. You're being built into a church. You. Into a holy priesthood. That's you. To offer up spiritual sacrifices. You are chosen. You are a royal priesthood. A holy nation. A people for God's special possession so that you might proclaim the mighty acts of the one who's called you. You have been chosen to proclaim all that is good, all that is holy, all that is right. The people God has placed in your lives, when God says, I redeem it, it doesn't matter if your life is as fulfilling as you thought. God is saying, even in those circumstances, if they don't change, I will give you purpose, and I will give you a mission to fulfill, and I have chosen you for that. 1 Corinthians 1:26 and 27. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. At one point in Maria's life, she's living in this horrible little corner of her house. Her son is back with her, except now he's paralyzed. He's out of prison. He was shot during a robbery. And now she's taking care of him. And literally we have to take food to her because she has no money. And in one pivotal moment, she breaks down and she says, I've given my life to Christ. Why are my circumstances this way? Like, what is wrong? What am I doing wrong? And I just listened to her and then I said, oh, Maria, I can't explain that. Like, I can't tell you why. But don't ever think that God isn't using you. You're everybody's hero. The people by this time, they know her situation. And yet she's not wearing a mask. She is authentically encouraging everybody she sees. Like this woman in every instance, she is coming up to bless and to speak truth and to speak life and encouragement. And everybody knows her condition. What does flourishing mean if you live in those conditions? It may not look like the pretty pictures, but it is infused with divine power. God didn't choose us because we live in divine places. He chose us in our brokenness. In the end, it's him that shines through. And I said, Maria, he shines through you all the time. There will come a time when you won't have this burden. But don't ever think that he has not filled you with purpose right where you are. So if we're going to have lives that are flourishing in purpose, we understand God's perspective, we understand God has a plan, and then we have a promise. And we'll deal with the slight need, but let me say before moving on to that, what does that mean for you? When I say who are the people God has placed in your lives, what does that mean? What does that mean that is your purpose to influence? It's the small things. One, you can start actually praying for them. Simple thing. Who are the people in your lives? Begin praying for them. Number two, be a person of influence. How would you act differently if you knew that your words mattered? And if they were to write down names or words that you have spoken into their life, they would be filled up with encouragement, with loving correction, with guidance. One of the most powerful things that I do as a leader isn't this. It's when I take a little note card as I'm reading a verse and some verse strikes out and I'll pray, who could this be for? And somebody comes to mind and I just jot them a note or an email or a text. Hey, I was reading the Bible, don't know why this came up. I thought of you, Or, hey, I really appreciate this about you. Or, just like I said with my kids, I didn't want boys because I didn't know if I'd be a good father. What about all the negative things that I learned, Well, I may not be able to do away with all the negative, but I can certainly do the positives. I can make sure, man, I may lose my temper, I may be this or I may do that, and I struggle with controlling it. But one thing I can intentionally do is let them know I love you, to say I care, to encourage you, to do this. That's all it is. That's speaking life and truth into people's lives. And you do not have to be a leader to do this in a church. You don't have to attain some spiritual thing. I have seen with a group of Mexicans in Guanajuato that were very poor with limited education. And we talked about this idea, and they made a list of the people God has put in their hands. And when they realized, you mean God's placed them in my hands? And that's my job? Even though I don't have employment or I'm struggling with this or my spouse is an alcoholic, he's given me a job. And my job is to speak life into people's lives. And this group just took off. It was amazing when we realized what God has for us. So let's go to the last one, the last lesson. God has a promise for us. God has a promise. And it's from Galatians 6, 7, and 8. But God's promise is we will reap what we sow if. And we'll fill that in a minute. But look what Galatians 6 says. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. So God is basically saying, I'm not going to be mocked. You're not going to be able to trick me. If you do good things, if you sow in the Spirit, you'll reap in the Spirit. Basically, it's a law that do unto others as you want them to do unto you. If you do good things, you're going to get good things. That's not just a Christian thing. That's in all major world religions. That's the fundaments of most societies, is this idea that if you do good things, if you sow like a farmer your seed, you're going to reap a harvest. Right? That's like a universal understanding. So we read that verse, but then we get to verse 9, where the author says, let us not become weary in doing good. If the law of the harvest, as it's called, if the law of the harvest is if you do good, you'll get good. If you show love, you'll get love. If you sow good things, you'll reap good things. Why does he talk about don't get discouraged? Why? I think we all know, like a farmer, he doesn't put out the seed and the very next morning have a harvest. Depends on a whole lot of other factors. The weather, plight, pests, time, the soil, all kinds of things, right? Final story I'll share is also from Ecuador, of a man who I met when he was in his 60s. Went to study the Bible with his daughter, and he had his back to us and would turn up the television. And then as we continued to study, he'd turn down the television, then he turned off the television, and then he turned his chair around, and I said, do you want to join? And this man had been an absolute jerk, to put it mildly, his entire life, to his entire family. They all lived together. Like, he had his adult children who were married and had kids living there. This man had been a tyrant. He had been a dictator. He had been abusive. He had drunk too much. He had other women and other families. He had treated his wife and his family horribly for most of his life. He came, I remember his wife actually, I didn't share this first service. She actually came to me because she thought I just didn't understand who her husband really was. And she said, this is who he, and she just went in on everything he had done to the family. And I said, well, could you ever forgive him? She's like, never. And I said, well, what would it take? And she said 3 things. And she listed them. He has to get baptized. He has to experience real change that we can see. And then he has to call the entire family together and confess what he's done and ask for forgiveness. And I said, all right, I can't do that. But God can. So we prayed. I didn't share it with anybody else except maybe Nisha. Within 6 months, he got baptized. He had demonstrated real change. He called a meeting of the entire family and asked for forgiveness. And I called his wife over for another private meeting. I said, do you remember that? And she said, yes. And I said, are you ready to forgive? And she says, I will never forgive. And later, Alberto is his name. Alberto had this radical conversion, and his kids made fun of him. He studied the Bible, seated in one plastic white chair, and they wrote, Hermanito corrupto, corrupt little brother, or corrupt Christian, on the chair. And he read what it means to be a leader in the church and an elder, and how an elder must have his house affairs in order. And he broke down weeping, saying, I could never be an elder because of the way I've lived my life. So we talked about this, and we drew a timeline of his life. And at 65, we put a cross where he accepted Jesus. And I said, Alberto, here's the honest truth. For 65 years, what were you sowing? What seeds were you planting? You were sowing your own seeds. You were living life your way. 65 years of ways of thinking, of creating ways of thinking and being and expressing yourself, of inflicting life on the people under your power, your way. At 65, Christ came in, and he wiped all the consequences away as far as your relationship to God. But don't be surprised after 65 years of sowing those seeds, you're going to be reaping those for a long time. But don't be discouraged, because if you begin to sow seeds now of good things, in the right time, you're going to see a harvest. And one of the most beautiful things is within a few years, his children are baptized. His wife is reconciled. That whole family. He passed away this last year along with his wife. His whole family adored him. God not only redeemed the negative, but he's the lived out incarnation of this verse. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. The time is now. God has placed people in your hands. Acknowledge your pain, acknowledge your inadequacies, but recognize God didn't choose you because you had it all together. And acknowledge and assume your priestly roles and begin to speak life into the people who God has placed in your hands. And don't get discouraged by the things that keep popping up. If you're persistent, the things you're sowing now will pop up in time. If you don't lose hope and you don't give up. We can flourish in our purpose, regardless of our circumstances. My wife and I aren't supposed to be living in Knoxville. We're supposed to be living in England at this point. We were moving from Spain to England, and our circumstances changed. And it hasn't been an easy adaptation. Knoxville was never even on our radar. My wife has spent a couple years now trying to figure out, what does it mean for me to flourish? We can flourish regardless of our circumstances when we understand and give God the power, knowing that He has the proper perspective, when we acknowledge his plan is to use us, and when we trust his promise that we will reap what we sow if we do not give up. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. I thank you that flourishing is what you intended all of your creation to do when you started the garden. It was good, it was good, it was good. And then suddenly it is not good. And it is difficult. And life is painful. And so many of us feel like we've lost years. Or we've had trauma inflicted on us. Or we're not the people that we think we need to be. And yeah, there are things we need to change, Father, but we also know that you have determined to use us wherever we are. And that flourishing doesn't just have to take place in a positive environment. As a matter of fact, you are glorified when out of our weakness, we demonstrate to a world a peace that passes all understanding, a joy that does not depend upon our circumstances, a resoluteness about their intentional way of living, even though everybody else may rise against us. That is what it means to flourish, Father. And that is what we need as your people. Amen.